time here at the Capitol. The gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise for a point of personal privilege.
The gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the House, as I contemplated how to contribute to our ongoing discussion about...
Ben, just for a second. Will the House please come to order? This is a point of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman has the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, I was giving some thought to how I could contribute to our ongoing discussion about Black History Month. And I thought about how often it is that history is changed by folks who didn't necessarily set out to change the world, but did. And I want to talk to you today about a Virginian whom I guess I'm gathering and I expect none of you have ever heard of. I confess I never have. But she sure did help change the world. Her name was Annie Harper. So far as I know, there are no monuments to her anywhere in Virginia or anywhere else. There's no government building named after her here or anywhere else. You have to dig real deep, as I did, into the history books before you even find the name Annie Harper. We know very little about her. We don't even know when she was born, Mr. Speaker. We do know that she lived in Gum Springs, Virginia, which is right near where George Washington's Mount Vernon sits. She never married. We also know that she supported herself principally by doing household and domestic work. I was able to find out the little information I do know about her, ladies and gentlemen, believe it or not, by reading a United States Supreme Court brief. It was the brief for the appellants in a case called Harper versus Virginia State Board of Elections. It was decided almost exactly 50 years ago on March 24th, 1966. You see, ladies and gentlemen, Annie was of such limited means that she could not afford to pay Virginia's poll tax. So she couldn't vote. And Annie Harper became the lead plaintiff in the landmark Supreme Court case which struck down Virginia's poll tax under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. It's fitting, I think, Mr. Speaker, that the named plaintiff in that case abolishing the poll tax would come from Gum Springs, Virginia. Gum Springs was formed by Mr. West Ford, who was one of George Washington's freed slaves. And Gum Springs was a place that he created in 1833 for freed slaves to work in the trades that they had served in as estate slaves at Mount Vernon. When I read the appellant's brief, Mr. Speaker, it simply says as follows: Appellant Harper, because she has been a resident of Virginia for more than 3 years and has never paid poll taxes, is required by Virginia law to pay 3 years back poll taxes, which was $1.50 a year in those days, plus a 5% penalty for late payment, as well as interest charges, in order to register and qualify to vote in any future state election. Everyone in this body knows, I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, that the poll tax had a long and horrible place in Virginia's history. In 1876, Virginia's Conservative Party, which I am surely unhappy to admit became the Democratic Party, amended the state constitution. That was 1876, and the Constitution on its face denied the right to vote to people who had not paid the poll tax. The constitutional amendment, which came right in the middle of Reconstruction, was implicitly and in fact more or less explicitly understood to make it more difficult for African American males to vote. 6 years later, in 1882, the Readjusters, a party named the Readjusters, which was a coalition of dissatisfied Democrats, Republicans, and African Americans, removed the poll tax from the state constitution. But just a few years later, in 1901, the state constitutional convention of that year resurrected the poll tax. You heard the gentleman from Fairfax yesterday talking about how that same constitution also constitutionalized segregation in schools. Well, that convention was convened largely for the purpose of disenfranchising as many African American voters as they could. That 1902 convention required voters to prove that they had paid that poll tax of $1.50 for each of the 3 years preceding. The provision effectively denied suffrage to most of Virginia's African American men. John Good, who at the time was president of that constitutional convention, and A.J. Montague, who was the Democratic candidate for governor, did, however, assure Mr. Montague's supporters in all of their campaign literature that, quote, no white man was to lose his vote under any changes in the new Constitution. In 1963, Annie Harper, remember Annie Harper? along with someone else named Evelyn Butts of Norfolk and a handful of additional plaintiffs from Gun Springs, they began the process of challenging the poll tax in Virginia. They filed a federal lawsuit, and they lost. They had to appeal to the Fourth Circuit, and they lost. They then appealed to the United States Supreme Court. And as it was making its way through the courts, the 24th Amendment, which did ban poll taxes in federal elections, was ratified in 1964, and the Voting Rights Act, which became law in 1965, made the imposition of a poll tax as a prerequisite for voting a violation of federal law. But neither the Voting Rights Act nor the 24th Amendment addressed the issue of poll taxes in state elections. So finally, in 1966, 90 years after Virginia first imposed a poll tax, Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court finally ruled that Virginia's poll tax violated the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And it was Justice Douglas who wrote in the court's majority opinion, quote, "Voter qualifications have no relation to wealth, nor to paying or not paying this or any other tax. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment restrains the states from fixing voter qualifications which invidiously discriminate." So, Mr. Speaker, although Annie Harper doesn't figure prominently in the history books, it is in no small part because of her, this otherwise ordinary but brave woman, and her fight to get access to the ballot, that the Supreme Court took the poll tax out of state codes all across America. And it was in the case bearing her name. So, Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the House, I hope that when we all vote next Tuesday in our presidential primary, we remember the name Annie Harper. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.